morning. I apologize that I will not be speaking in Portuguese today, or any day for that matter, because I don't speak it today or tomorrow or yesterday, I'm afraid. But that said, I have visited Brazil quite a few times and have written extensively about the country's rise as a geopolitical power, as an economic power, and I certainly do want to look to the future today as much as possible. So the topic that we have chosen is global scenarios for a post-crisis world. Now, some of you may be saying, what crisis? Here in Brazil, there wasn't a crisis. It was an American crisis, a European crisis. Other people might say, but the crisis is only just beginning here in Brazil. Look at our growth rate. Oh no. So it's a matter of perspective, isn't it? Whether or not we are before the crisis, during the crisis, or after the crisis. But let's take for granted for a moment that we are hopefully emerging, at least in the advanced economies, after 5 years emerging from this crisis. What does it mean? Great. Now, where do crises come from, in a way? It's from this very complex interrelationship between markets, policy, and disruptions, which are always chasing each other, in a way. We are familiar with the cliche that policymakers are always fighting the last war, markets are responding unpredictably to events, and it is hard to predict the correlations among these events. A correlated risk event, meaning the combination of an economic slowdown, a geopolitical crisis, that is still very much possible today. And we'll talk today about some of the scenarios that might be in our future, for better or for worse. So even if this is the first post-crisis year, could it be that we are laying the foundations for the next crisis? And that's something that we're going to explore today. Now, before going forwards, it's important to look back maybe just 1 or 2 years to the years 2011 and 2012. Next slide, please. Okay. What have been some of the chain reactions that are still, in fact, unfolding and playing out today? The first, you certainly recall, is the I don't want to give it away, I want you to see the picture. Okay, it's of course the Arab Spring. Now, why is it worth looking back at this? Because you may remember that shortly before the outbreak of the Arab Spring, exactly 2 years ago, Goldman Sachs had published its list of the next 11 leading economies. After the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, they published as the next 11. And Egypt was on that list, because Egypt was growing at 7%. The stock market was rapidly increasing in valuations. Its projected growth rate was expanding. What happened? Of course, this did. Where is Egypt today? Well, its projected growth rate is about 1%. I wonder if Goldman Sachs regrets having put Egypt in that next 11 category or not. And I'll come back to why it might be a mistake to think only in those terms. The second, again, 2 years ago, what happened? The Fukushima nuclear meltdown. A combination of a tsunami, an earthquake, a tsunami, a nuclear meltdown. And look at the ripple effects that it had around the world. Germany, a country that was moving towards 50% nuclear power by the year 2030, has decided to shut down most of its reactors and phase it out. Japan, of course, very much in the same direction. Major impact, of course, that is going to have on the cost of energy and the distribution of fuel in Asia and in Europe, all because of this natural catastrophe. So that's another example of a ripple effect that's still unfolding in our energy markets, going back a couple of years now. It's not over. A third example is, of course, the European debt crisis. In the aftermath of the American subprime mortgage meltdown, the exposure of European banks, the revelations that has had on the core balance sheet of those organizations, of those corporations. What has that resulted in? Of course, the freezing credit in the peripheral economies of the Eurozone, negative growth rates. There's still contraction predicted. As of this week, we're seeing that, again, 2013 will be a zero or negative growth year, even in some of the core economies. So the Eurozone, of course, is also not free from what began 4 or 5 years ago. So we have to think about what is happening today that might cause serious shocks, disruptions, and harm growth a few years from now still. And of course, the fundamental lesson is that we live in a very complex and very unpredictable world. And therefore, the way in which we can think about how we plan ahead is not to try and make predictions that are impossible. Nassim Taleb's definition of a black swan is not something that is so complex that you have to use mathematical formulas to try and make predictions. His fundamental message is that you cannot and will not ever be able to predict these events. And so the approach that we have to take is scenarios. We have to think about how we pull together, again, the political, the economic, environmental, social, technological trends, and build narratives, pictures of what the important uncertainties are, where they might take us, how we should prepare. And so you have to ask yourself, what if? What if such and such happens? What impact is it going to have on you? What are the unexpected things that you might have to prepare for? What surprises, in other words, are possible? How do you future-proof yourself? What are the responses that you have to build the capacity in your organization to confront? And so as you hear some of the empirical data that I will present today, and some of the scenarios that I will also present, ask yourself, what are the uncertainties in this for you? What are the greatest risks for you? And what alternatives might be possible as well? Let me give you an example of how some of these scenarios have been recently published. You're all familiar with Shell. Shell has been notable for conducting very intensive scenario planning research activities for decades. And their most recent scenarios that were just published fit into these three broad categories. One that they call Depression 2.0, the second one they call Blueprint, the third one they call Scramble. Now, to be honest, none of these are particularly positive outlooks on the future. They take a couple of years to formulate. They've spent the last couple of years working on them. It hasn't been the most positive economic environment, and of course there is a tremendous political, geopolitical instability. So as you can imagine, the world that they are putting forward for the year 2020 is an uncertain one, no matter which scenario you choose. But if you've had a chance to quickly just read these, the Depression scenario, which is really about economic nationalism and the lack of international coordination. The Blueprint scenario, which is perhaps their most optimistic one, which is about regionalism, experimentation, and so forth. And the third one, Scramble, which is again also about protectionism and great power rivalry and a lack of an energy transition towards a sustainable composition of resources. Which of these three do you think is most likely? For the year 2020, it's only 2013 now. Thinking more than even 5 years ahead is very, very difficult. But let me see, who favors the Depression 2.0 scenario? Is that where the world is going? Anyone? No? How about Blueprint? Raise your hands. Blueprint? And how about Scramble? Okay, so you're evenly divided in a way between Blueprint and Scramble. That's more or less where I see myself as well. Now, I've identified complexity and the need for scenarios as one of these mega trends. We are not going to be able to unravel complexity. And so I want you to remember that as one of the core themes of this lecture. The second one to think about is the question of globalization. In terms of megatrends, this is the second issue that I want to explore today. Globalization. I think this is, of course, the dominant question of our time. Is globalization going to reverse? Is it going to retrench? If it was Nouriel Roubini, the economist standing here today, that's what he would say. But I think, and there are good reasons to believe that. Let me give you 3 examples. In the last 10 years, at least 3 times, people have said this means the end of globalization. End of globalization. 3 times I've heard people saying this in the last 10 years. The first time was 10 years ago, after 9/11. No more trust across boundaries, fear of geopolitical consequences of 9/11, and so forth. The second time people started talking about the end of globalization was because of the collapse or failure of the World Trade Organization's Doha round, which still has not been passed, correct? So people have said without a comprehensive global free trade agreement, globalization cannot be sustained. And the third time, of course, was from 2008 onwards. The notion that the financial crisis was going to lead to a major unraveling of global finance, capital markets, and so forth. Now, all of these 3 events or phenomena have had a negative impact on globalization. But today, as we stand here, 10 years after 9/11, globalization has proven remarkably, amazingly resilient. Now let me explain why. I think that globalization is actually entering a new phase that is not appreciated by economists who only look at the very short term. If you look back 1,000 years, you can think about the Silk Road era. This was also globalization. This is when Europe, the Middle East, and the Far East created an inter-regional trading system that lasts to this day. Very often we speak about the new Silk Road today. And there's books written today with that title. And they're referring to this exact same geographic corridor of trade and finance. There was a colonial era of globalization as well, propelled forward by new technologies, especially maritime navigation. And the colonial era meant, of course, the conquest of this hemisphere and the discovery of peripheral parts of the world across the Pacific Indian Oceans as well. Then the Industrial Revolution, another core set of technologies propelling forward globalization. At that point, of course, it was mass industrial power, the steam engine, factories, eventually electricity, automobiles, and so forth. The industrial era conferred the advantage on Western Europe and on North America because they commanded those technologies and spread them around the world. Globalization as a word, we've only been using since this actually was the 4th phase, not the 1st phase, but the 4th major phase. And that's the mid-20th century. With the rise, the end of World War II, the internationalization of capitalism, particularly in the transatlantic world, the development of international institutions, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the World Trade Organization, and so forth. All of these help to spread global capital around the world. But it still wasn't global, actually. You can see that by the late 20th century, people started to speak about emerging markets, but they were really talking about China and India. You can see that Africa and Latin America, right here, were still ignored in the global conversation debate about the global economic system and which parts of the world really matter. So this is an outdated image, and most people still think that this is globalization, still driven by the core, let's say, OECD countries that used to represent 80% of the world's GDP, production, investment, and so forth. But that's not true anymore. And when I say that globalization is entering a new phase, this is what I mean. I mean that the ICT revolution, information, communications technology in particular, have only been with us. The internet, the personal computer has only been with us since the 1970s. The internet only the last 15, 20 years in terms of mass scale usage. So if globalization moves in these cycles of hundreds of years, we're just in the beginning of a phase in which technology, capitalism are combining to spread globalization to every part of the world. Now today, as we speak, for the first time in history, really every single country is becoming part of the globalization picture. If you read The Economist, you may have seen that even North Korea was on the cover 2 weeks ago. They said a change is happening in North Korea. It's a country now where people are they're buying automobiles from abroad, people are getting mobile phones, there are special economic zones, and they're looking for foreign investment. Even North Korea. That means there's not a single place left that is not part of globalization today. So the notion that it is reversing, I think, runs contradictory to at least 1,000 years of history, if not more. So this is why I'm a bit more optimistic than quite a few other people who only look at the short term. Now, what has been the impact of globalization on geopolitics? And this is the third sort of mega trend I want to talk about. Beyond complexity, globalization, let's talk about how this has affected the geopolitical landscape. In the 1990s, there was an expression after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It is the unipolar moment. And this is what a diagram of world power effectively looked like. But I think many people would agree this is not really true anymore. And I spent a lot of time thinking about how do we diagram power then if the unipolar moment of America is over. And this is what I have come up with, what I call the global marketplace. This is a very, very different picture. You can see in less than 20 years' time what a huge difference there is in the two images. What are some of the key differences? The first is obviously the world is multipolar. There is not one superpower sitting at the center. China is a superpower. European Union is still the largest economic bloc in the world. Brazil is a rising power. India is a rising power. All of these powers matter. Secondly, you can see that regionalism is extremely important. We always ignore the importance of regions. But besides the European Union, we now have the African Union, the Gulf Cooperation Council, ASEAN, the East Asian Community, and so forth. Quite a few regional organizations. Here, you are moving beyond Mercosur, and there is talk of a union of South American nations. We have to think about the fact that, the economic fact, that trade within regions, across borders, but within regions, is growing even faster than trade internationally. So that's the second reason why this picture looks very different. The third reason is that any one region can trade with any other region. If you look at the supply chains, the infrastructure, the investments in airlines and ports, shipping and so forth, there is no more intermediating power. All relations don't go through Washington or through Paris or through London. Just last week, Brazil was represented at the third Latin African Investment Conference, right? There has also been a Latin Arab Conference. Some of the data is absolutely staggering about these interregional relations. Chinese-African economic relations, trade and investment, have grown by 1,466% in the last 10 years. African-Indian trade has grown by 669%. Brazilian-African trade, 542%, and so on and so on and so on. Now, of course, this is starting from a very low base. But today, by the year 2012 already, the total volume of annual Chinese-African trade and investment is $166 billion. That is the same as the level with the United States and Africa, or Europe and Africa. So no one can say anymore, this is my backyard, right? Europe cannot say, oh, we were the former colonial powers in Africa, and this is still our backyard. Everyone is playing in all directions, and this is the diagram, this is the representation of that fact. And that is a rapidly shifting geopolitical order. Let me talk about another major trend that is shifting the parameters of how we think about the future, and that is the importance of technology. Now, the shell scenarios, which I showed you earlier, they do a good job of looking at technological issues, natural resources, demographics, economics, and so forth. But what needs to be emphasized in an almost deeper level is the role of technology. I mentioned the ways in which technology has driven waves of globalization that last for centuries. Well, that's certainly true when we think about our mindsets towards the nature of power. Geopolitics is a term that you all know very well, but it's a term from the 19th century. And geopolitics emphasizes your natural resources, your population size, your military size, your ability to project power across the oceans, and so forth. In the late 20th century, towards the end of the Cold War, some economists started to talk about geoeconomics. They said the likelihood of conflict is diminishing, and the way in which power is taking shape is driven much more now by economics. It is the size of GDP, the balance of payments, foreign exchange reserves, and so on. These are the drivers of power, people started to say back then. And they said it because of the European Union, because of the convergence, the coalescence of the European Union, and the ever larger economic size that represented with the formation of the single currency. But now in the 21st century, I think we need to add one more new term, and that is geotechnology, which is again different from the emphasis in geopolitics and geoeconomics. Because here we're talking about research and development spending, commercialization of new technologies, innovation in leading technological sectors, and so forth. And those have a big impact on geoeconomics and subsequently on geopolitics as well. We need all three of these lenses to understand global change. Let me give you a very simple example of why it's important to think in this way. Raise your hand if you know how many nuclear weapons China has. Right. So, I'm not surprised because it doesn't really matter that much, does it? What if I told you that it has 400 nuclear warheads? But 30 years ago, how many nuclear weapons did it have? Not that many less, actually. But did you think that China was a superpower 30 years ago? Probably not. Do you think China is a superpower today? You probably do. So it's not because of its military size. It's certainly because of its economic size. But how did China accrue all of those foreign exchange reserves? How did it build up those massive trade surpluses? How did it do that? Because of technology. Because it chose to take one low-end sector of the global value chain of manufacturing and to devote its manpower to that sector. And now it has accumulated surpluses, which it is investing in all sorts of areas, and that is enhancing its geoeconomic and its geopolitical power. But the story begins actually with very basic, very simple technology, not with aircraft carriers, or submarines, or nuclear weapons, because those things alone do not make China a superpower. They don't make anyone afraid, really, of China. So let's talk a little bit more about this balance of innovation and why the balance of innovation today might matter more than this traditional geopolitical notion of the balance of power. I mentioned leading sectors. In any given period, there are key technological clusters which require, or in which, if there is significant investment, it will translate into substantial geopolitical gain. And those include not just the traditional areas, manufacturing, now information technology, but also biotechnology, nanotechnology, alternative energy, robotics, and so forth. All of these are what are called the leading sectors of the future economy. They represent a growing share of GDP, a large share of R&D, and they can translate into very strategic technologies. And China, India, Singapore, Australia, and so forth are investing a very large amount We can come back to Brazil and these, with respect to these technologies soon. Now, another major trend. We've talked about complexity, globalization, geopolitics, technology. Now let's talk about urbanization. Urbanization is the next trend, which we always, these are things I'm identifying that you always have to keep in your mind as you're making future projections about the global business environment. Now, up until recently, the top 40 cities in the world that represented 1/3 of global GDP have been largely concentrated in the Western world, in the Northern Hemisphere. But if you look at the top 40 cities in the world according to their population growth and their economic growth, you see a much different picture. The cities are clustered now largely in the south, in the east, and in other words, in the emerging markets. Now, where you see demographic growth, infrastructure investment, economic growth coming together, that's where you have the conditions for a long-term positive growth cycle. And hence the focus ever more on cities, particularly cities in Asia, as the locus or as the economic engines of the future. And these are some, but not all, of the cities to watch. And these cities very often represent the dominant share of the economy of emerging markets, and they receive most of the foreign investment. And because that is true, there's one aspect of urbanization that we have to think about much more systematically, and that is inequality. And that is the next trend. Now, we have celebrated urbanization. Urbanization is talked about as something of certainly it's a secular megatrend. Most of the world's population now lives in cities. In fact, Latin America is the most urbanized continent in the world already. That has some negative economic implications, which I'll talk about in a minute. But rarely do people emphasize enough the structural relationship this has with inequality. Because it is not an accident that around the same time that the world population became urban, officially, in the last 3 or 4 years, that the global inequality rate within countries became greater than across them. In other words, the Gini coefficient within countries is now greater than that across them. And that is a very, very remarkable trend. It means that people living in Sao Paulo or Jakarta or in New Delhi or Moscow have more in common with each other than they do with people in their own countries who don't live in cities. So there is a entirely new strata of global economic, of living standards based on cities. But there's also, of course, so much inequality within cities, as we know here in Brazil, India, and other emerging markets. So we have to be very conscious about global inequality. And what this means, the wealthiest people in urban settings in key countries represent a huge share, a very substantial share, sometimes up to 20-25% of the GDP of both advanced economies as well as emerging markets. You can see this trend in the United States, but you can also see it here in Brazil. To take just one slice of that urban elite, which is of course billionaires. I don't know many billionaires who live in villages, so I'm presuming that the billionaires live in cities. And if that is true, and they fly in helicopters here in Sao Paulo, but that exacerbates inequality as well, doesn't it?